Welcome to Peace Halifax. This is year 5 anniversary of this celebration of peace in honor of United Nations International Day of Peace on September 21st. We are here on a Saturday, the 19th of September this year, with a full day of programming. You've joined us now for our international panel discussion with 3 very experienced and wise souls from around the world. Belinda Westcott, born and raised in the apartheid era of South Africa, is joining us today from South Africa. Samantha Fraser, working and living in London, having spent 20 years in service in the African continent, joining us from London today. And David Fletcher, community social activist with roots in the Caribbean and having worked a decade plus in the African continent, now serving community development here in Nova Scotia, Canada. So the 3 of them are joining us in a few moments. Stay tuned and enjoy as they offer their wisdom and insight into how
Welcome,
to create
everyone.
peace
This is our panel on
world.
peace in a divided world, and it's a conversation between 3 people living in different parts of the world at this time with 3 very different views. I'll introduce each briefly. Belinda here, you'll see on your screen, if you can wave. Belinda was born and raised in South Africa during the apartheid era, and has been meditating with the Brahma Kumaris, Raj Yoga, for 30 plus years. So using methods of peace in her own life and in the world she lives in now in South Africa, a rapidly changing society. And we have Samantha Fraser. If you put up your hand, Sam, say hi. Sam's born and raised in London, spent 20 years or so in the African continent in a variety of different countries, and is interested and is working right now in something very interesting in Brixton called Race, Let's Talk About It. Very interesting, and is a meditator and has been for 25 years or plus. So again, using meditation in her work as a teacher, but also in her volunteer life. And David Fletcher here is a community activist, has been for, 30 years or more, lives in Nova Scotia, Canada, near to Halifax, a couple and a half hours from here. He's been an educator, is an educator, has been an educator, and working in social justice for almost as long, well, longer, double the time of his meditation career, almost. So all meditators, all very interested in the state of the world, and all very interested in being part of creating a peaceful world. And we're here today to explore, well, how does one do that in a world divided? So I have just 2 questions for you. And the first one is to speak to us each, if you wouldn't mind, from your own perspectives, a little bit about what you see now in our world. I mean, for many of us, it seems like the world's getting more and more divided. So maybe your sense of what do you see as some of the divisions in the world? And what impact do those divisions are they having on us physically, economically, emotionally, spiritually? And and then we'll shift to the peace part. So if you can speak first about your perception, your experience of the divisions, what do you see as divisions in the world, and what causes that? So whoever would like to start first, we can start. Let's start with Belinda, our furthest away geographically from Halifax. Thank you, Belinda, for coming.
Thank you, Judy, and for the introduction. It's lovely to be here. And I think our topic is more relevant than ever. If I look around South Africa at the moment, and I know that this applies to the world out there, across the world, but life has become very suddenly a lot more insecure than it's ever been before. I think in a third world country like South Africa, there's always a lot of insecurity. There's job insecurity. There's food insecurity. So some fairly basic things. But now with the global pandemic, everything has been sort of everything has increased in its insecurity. And, you know, we watched during the early time of the lockdown how people lost their livelihood overnight just because of the lockdown. And for many, this was a huge tragedy and created, very, increased insecurity in so many people. Imagine that you just don't know where your next meal will come from, and whether you can pay the rent at the end of the month, or you might be on the street. So these are some of the things that were faced a few months ago now, but it came at us without any warning. It was just literally overnight. No one could prepare. And so what I see is that the more insecure people become, the more they tend to be self-centered, that they have to look to their own needs and try to solve their own problems. So we see that on one side, there's an increase in crime and domestic violence and corruption. And it's all due to the fact that our world and our lives are so fragile. And this pandemic has shown us how fast things can change. And so that's on the one side. We see this increase in what one could call selfishness. But on the other side, you also see how people reach out to each other. But, that's not for everyone. Our newspapers, our media is absolutely full of the crime and corruption that is happening around us. So those are some of my thoughts just on, what we're seeing at the moment. It's quite a fragile society, I would say, and people are deeply insecure.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Belinda. So the division's really a product of the insecurity that's increasing for all of us, but describing your scenario in particular in South Africa. Thank you. All right, Samantha, would you offer, please, your perspective on the divisions? What are they, and how are they affecting us, and what's causing them?
And I kind of really relate to what Belinda was saying, because I really feel that it's a time when all our normal supports, things that we would rely on, are actually have fallen away. And as Belinda rightly said, it does create a kind of void inside, and there is a lot of insecurity here in London, in the UK in general. Not every day, but frequently we're hearing now 7,000 people have lost their jobs from this particular department store. We had the results, the A-level results come out, and of course, young people, students did not get into the university that they had wanted to get into, because the marks they were given were not what perhaps they would have got if they were able to take the examination. And so I see a disconnect between young people actually and our adult world. It's like, I almost see it as, it's not even about Black, white, or Asian, it's about youth culture, who I feel doesn't have that support or stability, perhaps that I did when I was growing up. And I just feel that gap is getting even bigger. And so I think in this lockdown, on the one hand, yes, for some it's been a chance to connect inside. And there's also been an amazing amount of support from different organizations. I was reading, I was on a website yesterday called Teacher Support, because we're thinking of doing something similar for teachers who are practicing meditation. And it was wonderful to hear stories of people who had lost their jobs, or they were a supplied teacher, so when the lockdown happened, they had no means of income. And other teachers and other support networks getting together to really help them out financially in whichever way they could. And so when you hear those stories, there is some hope, but I don't think that's the norm. And so on the one hand, yes, it's the young and the old, but I also feel just what happened in America with George Floyd, and that triggered a whole range of demonstrations worldwide. And I really felt that George Floyd was a symbol of just discrimination on all levels. So whether it was Germany or wherever, people were demonstrating because they were able to voice whatever frustrations they were having in his name. And I feel in London, I feel that's more subtle, and I feel we have to have many more conversations around this whole divide, I think, in terms of race and class and all of that particular area. And I see it more and more, how it's so incognito, but it's there and it's having an impact, and it is creating not even a subtle divide, a divide, because nobody is talking about that particular division, which is historical. We're talking hundreds and hundreds of years. And what I really realize actually now is that, you know, you can change laws just as they've done in South Africa, but without education, the same belief systems, the same divide continues. And that's what I see, not just in the UK, but around.
Very interesting. Thank you, Sam. I know, David, you know, a lot of community justice and social justice work is about changing systems. And I'm hearing Sam say, well, we can change the laws, but without the consciousness of the people changing, you know, then what really changes? Can you speak a little bit about the divisions you see and what you feel is causing them from your perspective?
I mean, I think as you know, Belinda said, there's increasing insecurity and people then get more competitive. And as Samantha was saying, there's a greater divide that's becoming more polarized between people during these recent times. But, you know, my sense is many of these divisions, whether it's because of economic status or race and ethnicity or class or caste or sexual orientation or whatever, have been around for a long time. And they're things that many of us have worked on for a long time. And the splintering seems to be accelerated and more exacerbated in recent times. And so much of my work over the years has been acknowledging the divisions, but recognizing the solidarity that can be found between them, and the fact that people experience different divisions in different ways. But if we step back from that, we realize that we all have certain kinds of divisions that we experience in our lives, and we can work together in community and in solidarity to overcome them. And we look at the positive things and the possibilities rather than the divisions. But what's come to me so much in recent years, and especially during these COVID times, is the fragmentation has got so extreme that I don't know if the same kinds of ways we've tried to bring things back together in the past is going to work for the situation we have in the present. You know, they talk about the gap between the rich and poor is much worse now than it's ever been before. They talk about some of the issues in terms of the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in Canada and the North American context keeps getting worse and worse rather than getting better, and the establishment doing anything to make changes in that way. So I think it's a time where we really have to step back from those things and not look at where they come from and what the root of them is on the surface, but take a different kind of perspective on them. And maybe that will give us some insights that that we haven't brought to our work before. And for me, it's been my study and my spiritual journey where I've begun to see how we understand ourselves as beings and how we understand the drama, the things that are happening in the world in a different way that can be really helpful in understanding what the divisions are and where they come from in these times. So they're big issues that can be overwhelming at times, and I think we need to look at them in perhaps a very different perspective than we have in the past.
Thank you, David. So is the world becoming more divided? Is that your sense of it? That's what I'm hearing from the three of you. You're doing thin, and it feels like listening to you that it's like the pressure cooker of the world is kind of intensified, and especially as you speak about COVID, it's revealing much of what was there before, but also exacerbating what was there before. So what Belinda was saying about the insecurity makes it more so. And what you're saying, David, it was always there. We were always working with these issues. And Samantha, you saying the same thing, only more in an incognito kind of hidden way. So maybe it's coming to the surface now. You know, to David's point about bringing peace, we're all meditators. We've all been meditating for years. We all understand peace begins on the inside out, that there's something about a divided me that creates a divided world. And so, you know, creating peace. But, you know, how do we bring that in a world? I'm trying to make the link between peace and this divided world. And to your point, David, that maybe the old methods don't work anymore. And I don't know that we give up on the old methods. And what are they? Activism, protest, policy change. I mean, I don't think we're going to throw them out the window necessarily, but I hear you kind of calling for something new, something in addition. What is your sense of what do we need now? Both in terms of maybe revealing or exposing, or do we need to expose these divisions more? Do we need to name them? Do we need to talk about them? Or do we need to be doing the kind of solidarity work that you were talking about, David, which has always been there in the face of divisions? Open question for all of you. Yeah,
I mean, for me, it's yes, yes, and yes. We need to acknowledge the divisions. We need to be willing to talk about them. We need to practice all the activities that we have in the past in terms of policy change and systemic change and raising awareness about the issues in their historical context. But I think in addition to that, we need to explore a little bit our own consciousness and our own understanding of who we are as beings and what our roles are and what our parts are in the world at this time. Because I think the divisions are getting greater, and if we continue to use the same kinds of, I think Einstein said this one time, if we continue to use the same kinds of tools to overcome the situation we have, we're just going to be perpetuating what's there. So we need to do something quite different. And I know, Samantha, one of the things you've done recently on the Brixton connections and conversations is talk about the different layers of me and helping people understand those different layers. And I think that kind of perspective to get people thinking not about me as this body of this particular makeup at this time in the struggles in front of me, but to stand back a little bit and realize where that comes from. And there's a a core inside us that's much different and is not defined by the external context is a really, I think, useful and powerful perspective to take.
I agree. Actually, yesterday that was the conversation. It was called Understanding the Layers of Me for the Conversations. And I think it is about education and it is about conversation. And I think there's a backdrop of all of these things, all of these divisions of race and class and sexual orientation and whatever it is. But against that backdrop, it's possible to find a resource inside that can help me to not be influenced so much. I think it's a journey. It's not that we are not influenced just like that. I think it's always in the background for me, especially. But I think what the important thing is when I can see it play out. I can see this backdrop play out in a real way and almost just observe it and decide not to get caught up in that. And I think it's very important when we have a sense of self that hasn't been defined by something external. And that's something that we have to work on individually, if you like. And it is about allowing myself time to access my own inner core and to recognize that we've all experienced peace and happiness that has been triggered by external factors. So we know it's inside. There are times when we have felt empowered by certain situations and it's been triggered by something external. But that's always come from the inside. And I think the time now really is to allow myself to research how can I become my own trigger from within myself so that I'm not at the mercy of anything external. And I don't experience those highs and lows because of that. And so very much, I think, it is about authentic conversations. I think people do need to just voice what they're sharing. And I think when you give voice to it, that in itself is very, very empowering. And I remember when we had our first conversation about race, somebody just said, just breaking the silence and sharing my story has helped. As simple as that. And so the more we can trust and create safe spaces for each other to have these conversations, no matter whatever the division is, I think is a huge start. And along with that, creating time for me to explore the inner resources that have always been there, but I just haven't been able to give myself time to access them and to explore them.
So to be clear, Samantha, when we say the layers of me and not defined by the external, what we're meaning is I'm not defined necessarily by my gender, even though I have one. I'm not defined by my skin color, even though I have one. And even though the world might define me in certain ways according to that and put me in a box or a category, which has huge repercussions socially, spiritually, economically, everything, politically, but that I can choose to step back from that definition of self that has been labeled on me because of my skin color or gender or anything, and choose not to define myself that way, to define myself as the one within, the spirit of the being. And in so doing, there's true empowerment. And I'm not fighting against something anymore. I'm embodying my true self. Is that sort of the conversation as it's gone in the race? Let's talk about it.
That's a great summary. Absolutely.
Okay.
Yep.
Wow. Okay, that's very nice. Belinda, you would have something to say about this, ever so quietly listening to us as you have been.
Judy, yes. First of all, you asked the question, do we have to expose this divide? What I see here in South Africa is that the pandemic is exposing so many things. Wherever there's a weakness, wherever there's injustice, it's all bubbling up, it's all coming to the surface, and it's there for everyone to see. And as uncomfortable as that may be, it's a very good thing, because I think just seeing it is part of the process that Sam was talking about. We have to see it and we have to acknowledge it. And I remember one article I was reading where they were saying it's time to get off the fence and stop, sort of having this feeling, well, I'm okay, so that's the main thing, and not worry about others. That we have to come together as a society. And this is the time where these incredible divides can actually heal. Because, I grew up in an incredibly unjust country, and it was not a good experience. Even though I was privileged, it was not a good experience. And what I'm seeing now is, as Sam was saying, you can change the laws, but when you look at the disparity in wealth, in living conditions, in opportunities, it still is not a just society. You can see the advantages, and a lot of the wealth is still in the hands of the minority. But we do see that there, across the races, there is an increase in wealth, but it's such a huge divide. You're either becoming extremely wealthy, or you're at the lower end where it's hard to feed your family on a daily basis. And that just seems to be getting, I think David spoke about that, it just seems to be getting wider. So when we start, well, let me speak for myself. There are certain things which are obvious, and on a spiritual journey, you check deep within yourself and see whether your spirituality is really authentic. Because, when you're raised in a particular way, there are certain very subtle prejudices which are there, whether you want to acknowledge it or not acknowledge it, it's there. And so when you start looking within, initially maybe it's not so clear, but in time you have to address these things. And my experience is that, as Sam mentioned, that talking about it is so healing for everyone. Being able to express yourself, even your prejudice, your inability to have that equality of vision, and to be able to really see it for what it is, and then to apply the spiritual principles of really understanding, first of all, who I am, beneath all of this external show. Because when that becomes clear, then how I perceive others, it has to be the same, because now you've seen the truth of yourself, and so you can see the truth of another and become free. And I think that's really what I would like, is to really be free, to have that deep sense of equality for every single human being. And it's got nothing to do with the external and everything to do with the beauty of the Spirit, the divinity of the Spirit. Thank you.
Maybe if I can just build on that, you know, the divisions in the world are so many and being exposed so much in these days. But I think in many ways they're divisions between the haves and the have-nots, or the powerful and the less powerful. And very often that power is expressed by one group over another group. We hear about, you know, the 1% of people who hold most of the wealth in the world, etc., and the other 99% that are struggling to make it through day to day. And it makes me think of, we live within this world where there's this framework of power over, from certain groups over other people. But there's other ways of thinking about power, and sociologists talk about, you know, the power to do things, the agency that we have to do things, the power with others by working cooperatively and in solidarity with others. But they also talk about the power within. And where does that power within come from? And often it's talked about as, well, there's this other one, but people don't really explore it so much. And I think at this time, it's such an important point or time in the world to explore that power within that each of us has, and each of us can hold on to, and each of us can express in different ways. And we still need to recognize what's happening in the external environment, and how it's influenced us, both giving us certain privileges and marginalizing us in certain ways, but not to let that be what controls us, but to use that power within, that spiritual power or divine power, as you described it, Belinda, as what enables us to take action and be content and happy and energetic and enthusiastic in the world. So that power within, I think, is such an important thing to cultivate at this time.
Just to add to that, as I'm listening to David, I think it's also important to look at our belief systems, because as you both shared, we've all been conditioned in a certain way, and that seems to be right in a sense. And I think part of really tapping into this inner power is being really clear about the limiting beliefs that I still have about myself or certain groups, whoever they may be. And I think that requires a lot of honesty as well, because those beliefs have shaped me. They have actually provided some kind of security as well, because I've used them for so long, and it kind of works. It's what I know. And in a way, when people talk about, you know, as we've all experienced this power within, for some people it's kind of unknown ground, actually, and it's a bit scary, because I've been relying on these external supports, and I've been relying on even my own belief patterns, even if they haven't been helping me. And that has, in a way, created some kind of stability, even if it's temporary, for certain individuals. And so I think it really is a question of looking at how all of those titles or conditioning has shaped me as an individual, and how many of those labels am I still buying into. And I think that's the first step. If I can see it, as I said before, then I can step out of it. But first of all, I need to be able to be confident enough to let go of beliefs that I've used for decades, and that other people have used instead of my reinforced it. It's just a community. It's not just my family. It's the education system have reinforced it, my friends perhaps, and now to have a new paradigm that I haven't yet experienced is quite something for people. So I think it really is a question of just being aware, first of all, what's shaping me, and being able to name that first of all.
So if some of the pressure cooker in the world right now that is revealing these divisions is also revealing or bringing to the boiling point our frustration with being trapped in labels, and that's a common theme, then what happens when I want to move beyond the label? As you're saying, Sam, suddenly what, I'm label less? And how awkward and uncomfortable that might feel. And yet, is this not the territory of true equality and freedom? Is that we stop defining each other by some label, that we start just seeing human spirit, you know, qualities behind the eyes, you know, energy, beings of, of qualities, of virtues, you know. So it's an interesting comment that in some ways there's comfort in struggling against being labeled, but even that can be comfortable. And so if the option is then to have no label and I suddenly feel uncomfortable with that, then what do we do? Very interesting unknown territory that brings us to, isn't it? Because you know, it's sort of like when you meditate. I remember when I first learned to meditate with another tradition, our practice was to stop thinking. And I mean, I was such a failure. You know, I could not empty my mind. I could not stop thinking. And then when I came to this practice, the Raja Yoga, I thought, oh, isn't this a relief? I don't have to stop thinking. I can select a thought that's full of, you know, beauty or full of nice energy and think about that and get absorbed in it. So in the same way with identity, just to remove a label, then what have I left? I have to have something left. Which is why I think, Belinda, you said, you know, who am I is the first question, you know, really understanding who am I? Well, I am the spirit behind in the costume. So that's lovely. And this is inner power, power within, as you're saying, David, rather than power over, etc. And I'm just struck by, Belinda started our conversation by saying, as we get more and more insecure, we become more selfish. And the events of the world make us sort of close in on our own, you know. How then do we sort of use inner power and even be thinking about myself in a bigger way and then others at the very same time that the world is kind of making me want to shrink inside and just take care of my own?
And I think those are the competing paradigms in some ways. Mm-hmm. You know, when you talked about all these labels are really just a costume we wear over our true selves. I think that's really true, but the costume also influences the way we are in the world and the way other people treat us. So we can't just take the costume off, but to recognize in ourselves and with others that we're all wearing costumes at this time. But that sense, and I know Belinda wanted to say something as well, but that sense of the competing paradigms of things falling apart and us wanting to find a way to put them back together or relate to each other, etc. You know, I think part of it is a sense of belonging. And there's this sense of, as the pressure cooker increases, people are often competing for resources and competing for time and competing for toilet paper in North America and other things became a big deal. But at the same time, there's been so many examples of solidarity and sharing and cooperation and community. And I mean, I live in a town of 5,000 people, and we had a solidarity march for Black Lives Matter, and there was over 4,000 people that came out and marched in solidarity. So there's the good and the bad happening at the same time. But I think for many people, there's this sense of the momentum of the world is going in a particular direction, and maybe it's controlled or taken in that direction by a few. And so many of us would like to belong to a different kind of world. and to be part of a different kind of world? And how do we cultivate that sense of belonging that's recognizing ourselves as spiritual beings, but also recognizing everyone else as spiritual beings? And it's, I think it's an ongoing process of learning. But I know, Belinda, you wanted to comment as well.
Yes, Judy, you spoke about this, you know, when you take off the labels, then what are you left with? And I remember, it's now many years ago, going through that experience because of an illness, and finding myself in a place where all the identities and all the things that I held on to were no longer relevant. And I found myself in this very strange space of just feeling like this emptiness, but not a negative emptiness. It's just like a void. In fact, they sometimes call it that, the void. And the void for me is all about allowing myself to be vulnerable. And there was a lovely quote, I liked it so much. He who allows himself to be vulnerable is trusted. And it's so difficult for us to allow ourselves to be in that space and to be okay with it. And yet it's so important, because out of that comes something new. In a sense, you have to really let go of the things that, as Sam said, you know, made you feel comfortable, simply because they don't serve you anymore. And if they don't serve you, they're certainly not serving anyone else. And I think that for me, it was an opportunity to recreate, to see things differently, to see myself differently, and just to be patient and allow that process to unfold, which it did in a beautiful way. But I liked very much what David was saying about that we need a sense of belonging. And, you know, if we hear wonderful stories about how communities come together, but in this country, there's still an enormous percentage of the population who do not feel that anybody cares. And, you know, when we talk about, you know, Black Lives Matter, it's actually I matter. And it's, and you know, to have this sense that everyone matters, and that for some, to make them feel, or to give them the experience that they are cared for, you have to do something very physical, very practical. And so just the inner work is that it needs to come from the right place. You are not being charitable. This is my brother's soul. And I care deeply for this soul. And so whether it's something that I can do, or just a word that gives comfort, you know, to someone who is really, really struggling, whether it's struggling physically, mentally, emotionally, that there is that genuine loving care. And this is really soul to soul. It's nothing else. Yeah.
Thank you, Belinda. That's beautiful. We've covered a lot of territory, and I know we could talk more, but we've got about 5 or 6 minutes left. And I'm thinking that a nice way to end might be just to have a couple of moments of silent meditation together, and maybe just with a couple of words from you, Belinda, to guide us into the right space. And then our viewers, those that are with us, can also just take a couple of moments to digest and reflect on what they've heard. And then we'll end with just a final statement from each of you, almost like a statement of hope for the world, if that's all right. Would you mind, Belinda, just for 2 or 3 minutes, if you just say a couple of words to get us into our own inner power, the power within, and that allows all of us just to digest what we've been saying and sharing. It's been so deep and rich. And then we'll just hear from each of you to end, if that's all right.
So in this time of reflection, let me just take a nice deep breath, relax, and we turn our attention and focus inwards, because it is really the inner being that is the source of our attitudes, our beliefs, and our feelings about the world, about ourselves. We acknowledge that inner being, all of us, is that spiritual self. And this is irrespective of the labels and the differences that we may see. And we connect to each other as these spiritual beings of peace. Of love, acceptance, of understanding. So we take these few moments to reflect on who we are. As a spiritual family.
Thank you, Belinda. Thank each of you for being here and joining me in this just jump into it conversation so quickly. But if you can each just offer a final statement to everyone watching and to our world, a statement of hope, creating peace in divided times. Sam, would you like to start?
Yeah, I was just reflecting as I was listening to Belinda and David that we're talking about division, but one thing about COVID, as we've heard, it hasn't discriminated between anyone. It's affected every single individual, regardless of those labels. And I really feel that human beings, all of us, we are very, very resilient. And there's something about the human spirit that at times of challenge, at times of difficulty, we have this innate ability to find something inside of ourselves. Something that's almost like a light, a small light of hope, if you like, that can ignite many other lights. And I would really encourage all of us, and I say this for myself, to really do one thing every day that can enable my light to be lit. I'm not talking about a huge light, but just even a small light, and that can ignite the lights of others. And so I feel that it's really about tapping into what we all have. And at times like this, it's an opportunity to dig down deep and emerge that strength that can take us through and beyond the situations that we face now. So thank you, Judy, for this lovely conversation. And thank you, Belinda and David.
David, for you?
Just to echo the thanks to be able to have this kind of a conversation. I feel in some ways it was just the beginning of a conversation. There's so many other things that could be discussed. But one of the things for me as I look outside at our natural environment that we're part of, you know, the world, civilization, whatever, goes through these cycles of time. And part of those cycles of time that we learn from resilience and other studies are times of creative destruction that then leads to growth and rejuvenation and change. And I think sometimes in these difficult times, it's important to step back and take a broader perspective and a longer time frame perspective, and recognize that what this body is experiencing at this time is not the whole story. There's a bigger story, and can we take some comfort? Can we take some hope? Can we be contented with the current time, realizing that it's part of a bigger story and a bigger environment that we're part of? And for me, that's maybe another conversation, but it's an additional part that gives me hope. As spiritual beings, we're eternal beings, and we're part of a much bigger story than what's just happening right now at this time. So that's something that gives me hope as well.
Thank you, David. And Belinda, the final word to you.
I think for me, you know, whilst we watch so many things falling apart, so many structures and many people's lives falling apart, but I do feel that if we realize that the way we were going was unsustainable, and that here we actually have, probably for the first time, maybe in history or for a very long time, we have the opportunity to change direction and to create something different, something that is sustainable, something that is just, that we can have a world where resources are more fairly distributed, and that includes opportunities and resources, physical resources as well. But that's a big picture, and a big picture needs a big heart. And I mean this in a deeply spiritual way, that to really open the heart to accept and embrace our family that we are on this planet with, and then we can do amazing things. And thank you, Judy. It's been lovely.
Thank you. That is such a precious message. Big world, big picture, big hearts. Thank you, Samantha. Thank you, David. Thank you, Belinda, for joining me. And thank you to everyone listening. This was meant to be food for thought. It was meant to give hope, but also to face and name some of the things that we are looking at in the world right now. And I feel I'm leaving with a feeling of peace and a feeling of hope and a feeling of certainty. Good things are to come in the midst of all the upheaval. So thank you very much. Peace, creating peace in a divided world.
Thank you.